April 29, 2009. A man cutting firewood in the quiet woods near Teresa, Wisconsin, made a discovery that would haunt an entire community for 13 years. Inside a black garbage bag, abandoned like discarded trash, was the body of a newborn baby girl. Full term, 8 pounds, 20.5 inches long, she appeared perfect in every way except one crucial detail that would launch one of Wisconsin's most heartbreaking cold cases. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The woodcutter's hands trembled as he called 911, his voice breaking as he tried to explain what he'd found on that remote stretch of lone road. Less than a mile from State Highway 175, within minutes, Dodge County Sheriff's deputies were racing through the rural landscape, their sirens cutting through the morning air like a cry for justice that wouldn't be answered for over a decade. When Detective Sarah Mills arrived at the scene, she'd seen plenty of disturbing crime scenes in her 15-year career, but nothing quite like this. The garbage bag sat beneath a cluster of oak trees, maybe 50 yards from the road, as if someone had wanted to hide what they'd done, but couldn't bring themselves to go deeper into the woods. Inside that bag was evidence that would eventually crack the case wide open. But in 2009, it seemed like the baby girl would take her secrets to the grave. The Dodge County medical examiner, Dr. P.J. Schobel, arrived within the hour to begin the painstaking process of examining the scene. What he found defied easy explanation. This wasn't a case of violence or obvious abuse. The baby showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of harm inflicted after birth. Instead, all the evidence pointed to something far more complex and tragic: fetal demise, meaning this little girl had likely died during or just before birth. But here's where the case took its first mysterious turn. If this baby had died naturally during childbirth, why was she found abandoned in the woods? Where was her mother? Why hadn't anyone sought medical help? These questions would plague investigators for the next 13 years, driving them to pursue every lead, every possibility, every desperate hope that they could give this child the justice she deserved. The community of Teresa, a small Wisconsin town with fewer than 1,200 residents, was shaken to its core. This was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where doors stayed unlocked and children played freely in the streets. The discovery of baby Teresa, as she quickly became known, shattered that sense of security and innocence that small-town America holds so dear. Local residents began showing up at the sheriff's office, desperate to help. They organized search parties, distributed flyers, and started a fund to ensure the baby would receive a proper burial. The outpouring of community support was unprecedented in Dodge County's history. These people had never met this child, didn't know her family, but they were determined that she wouldn't be forgotten. Todd Michael, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, stepped forward immediately. Without hesitation, he donated all the funeral services, refusing to accept payment for what he considered a sacred duty. The sheriff's office chaplain, Timothy Bauer, prepared to conduct a service for a child whose name they didn't even know, whose family remained a complete mystery. On May 11th, 2009, exactly 12 days after baby Teresa was found, the entire community gathered at Lowell Cemetery in southeastern Dodge County. It was one of the most heart-wrenching funerals anyone in attendance had ever witnessed. Hundreds of people, most of whom had never even heard of this baby before April 29th, came together to lay her to rest with dignity and love. The tiny white casket was surrounded by flowers donated by local florists, toys brought by children who wanted to make sure baby Teresa wasn't alone, and cards from people across Wisconsin who had heard about the case on the news. Chaplain Bauer's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke about the sanctity of life and the community's commitment to seeking justice for this innocent child. But even as they mourned, investigators were working around the clock to solve the mystery. They'd found crucial evidence at the scene that they hoped would eventually lead them to answers. Inside the garbage bag with baby Teresa, they discovered a maxi-pad wrapper that would prove to be the key to cracking the case 13 years later. Detective Mills carefully packaged the wrapper and sent it to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab in Madison, hoping the latest DNA technology could extract genetic material that would identify the baby's mother. In 2009, genetic genealogy was still in its infancy, and the results were frustratingly inconclusive. They had a DNA profile, but without a match in the national database of convicted felons and sex offenders, it was essentially useless. The investigation continued for months, then years. Detectives followed up on every tip, every lead, every desperate call from someone who thought they might have information. They investigated missing persons reports, reached out to hospitals across the state, and interviewed countless women who had been pregnant around the time baby Teresa was born. One of the most challenging aspects of the case was the complete absence of any missing person report. Nobody had reported a pregnant woman disappearing. No family had come forward claiming they'd lost contact with a daughter or sister who might have been expecting a child. It was as if baby Teresa's mother had simply vanished without leaving any trace behind. Sheriff Dale Schmidt, who took over the case in 2013, brought fresh eyes and renewed determination to the investigation. He'd heard about the baby Teresa case when he was still a deputy, and it had haunted him ever since. The idea that someone could abandon a child like that, leaving a community to grieve for a baby they'd never known, violated everything he believed about justice and human decency. Schmidt understood that time was running against them. Wisconsin's statute of limitations for concealing the death of a child was only 6 years, which meant that by 2015, whoever was responsible could no longer be prosecuted. This legal technicality threatened to deny baby Teresa the justice she deserved. But Schmidt and District Attorney Kurt Klomberg had a plan. In 2014, 5 years after baby Teresa's death, they took an unprecedented step. Working together, the sheriff's office and district attorney filed formal charges against the baby's mother's DNA profile, listed only as Jane Doe. This brilliant legal maneuver stopped the statute of limitations clock and ensured that when they finally identified the mother, she could still be held accountable for her actions. The Jane Doe warrant was a bold move that required careful legal consideration. They had to prove to a judge that they had sufficient evidence to believe a crime had been committed, and that the DNA profile represented a specific individual who could eventually be identified and charged. It was a complex legal argument, but Judge Martin DeVries approved the warrant, keeping the case alive for future prosecution. For the next 7 years, the baby Teresa case remained active but cold. Detectives periodically revisited the evidence, hoping that advancing technology or new investigative techniques might provide the breakthrough they desperately needed. The DNA profile sat in databases across the country, waiting for a match that seemed like it might never come. The case gained renewed attention in 2018 when genetic genealogy solved the Golden State Killer case in California. Suddenly, law enforcement agencies across the country were learning about this revolutionary new tool that could use public DNA databases to identify suspects through their family connections. Detective Mills, now a veteran investigator with over 20 years of experience, immediately began researching how genetic genealogy might apply to the baby Teresa case. The process was complex and time-consuming. Unlike traditional DNA matching, which relies on exact matches in criminal databases, genetic genealogy uses partial matches from people who have voluntarily submitted their DNA to services like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. By building family trees and tracing genealogical connections, investigators can sometimes identify suspects who have never been arrested or had their DNA entered into law enforcement databases. In early 2021, Sheriff Schmidt made the decision to partner with Ramapo College in New Jersey, which had developed one of the most advanced genetic genealogy programs in the country. The college's team of genetic genealogists had successfully solved dozens of cold cases, using their expertise to trace family connections that had previously seemed impossible to unravel. The collaboration between Dodge County and Ramapo College represented a new chapter in the Baby Teresa investigation. For the first time in 12 years, investigators had access to cutting-edge technology that might finally provide the answers they'd been seeking. The DNA profile from the maxi pad wrapper was carefully analyzed and prepared for genetic genealogy research. What happened next would vindicate every detective who had refused to give up on Baby Teresa, every community member who had kept her memory alive, and every family member who would finally learn the truth about what happened on that tragic day in April 2009. The breakthrough came not through traditional police work or lucky breaks, but through the painstaking scientific process of genetic genealogy that would revolutionize cold case investigations across America. But the story of how they identified Baby Teresa's mother and the shocking revelation of what really happened on the day she died would prove more complex and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. The truth, when it finally emerged, would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about the case and force an entire community to grapple with questions about justice, forgiveness, and the devastating consequences of shame and fear. The woman responsible for Baby Teresa's death had been living less than 2 hours away for the entire 13 years of the investigation, carrying a secret that had consumed her life and shaped every decision she'd made since that terrible day in 2009. When genetic genealogy finally led investigators to her door, they would discover a story of denial, desperation, and decisions that would haunt multiple families for the rest of their lives. The genetic genealogy team at Ramapo College began their analysis in February 2021, 12 years after Baby Teresa was found. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, one of the nation's leading experts in forensic genetic genealogy, personally oversaw the case, understanding the emotional weight and legal implications of their work. What they found in those first few weeks of analysis would set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring justice for Baby Teresa. The DNA profile from the maxi pad wrapper yielded several promising leads when uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genetic genealogy database. Unlike the criminal databases that had been searched repeatedly since 2009, GEDmatch contained DNA profiles from hundreds of thousands of people who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic information from companies like Ancestry and 23andMe. The initial results showed several potential matches at the second and third cousin level, indicating that Baby Teresa's mother had relatives who had participated in recreational genetic testing. Dr. Fitzpatrick's team began the painstaking process of building family trees for each potential match, working backward through generations of genealogical records to identify common ancestors and forward to identify living descendants who might be the mother they were seeking. The breakthrough came in March 2021, when the genealogists identified a cluster of matches that all pointed to a particular family line in southeastern Wisconsin. The common ancestors appeared to be German immigrants who had settled in the Milwaukee area in the late 1800s, and their descendants had remained in the region for multiple generations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Detective Mills received the call on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. Dr. Fitzpatrick's calm, professional voice couldn't hide the excitement underlying her words as she explained that they had identified a primary suspect, Karin Sue Luttinen, a 45-year-old woman living in Milwaukee who worked in sales and marketing. The genetic evidence was compelling but not definitive. Lieutenant appeared to be baby Teresa's mother, based on the family tree analysis, but they needed a direct DNA sample to confirm the match. This meant approaching her carefully, without revealing the true nature of their investigation, to request a voluntary DNA sample. Sheriff Schmidt and Detective Mills spent hours planning their approach. They needed to be strategic about how they contacted Lieutenant, understanding that any misstep could result in her refusing to cooperate or potentially fleeing the area. They decided to start with the baby's father, whose identity they had also determined through the genetic genealogy investigation. On January 29, 2021, Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the Wisconsin Department of Justice Division of Criminal Investigation made the first contact. She approached the man who genetic testing indicated was baby Teresa's father, explaining that they were investigating an old case and needed DNA samples to eliminate him and his family members from consideration. The father, whose name has been withheld from public records to protect his privacy, was completely cooperative but clearly confused by the request. He had no knowledge of any pregnancy involving his girlfriend, no memory of any missing person from their social circle, and no awareness that he might have fathered a child who had died. When Agent Walsh asked about his relationship with Karen Lieutenant, the pieces began falling into place. Yes, they had been dating in 2009. Yes, she would have been approximately 33 years old at the time. Yes, he would be willing to provide a DNA sample. And he believed she would be cooperative as well. The father's DNA sample confirmed what the genetic genealogists had predicted. He was indeed baby Teresa's biological father. Now they needed to approach Lieutenant directly, knowing that her reaction might provide crucial insights into what had really happened 13 years earlier. Agent Walsh made the approach on a cold February morning, arriving at Lieutenant's Milwaukee home with backup officers positioned discreetly nearby. When Lieutenant answered the door, Walsh introduced herself and explained that they were investigating an old case and needed to eliminate her from consideration through DNA testing. Lieutenant's initial reaction was telling. According to the police report, she appeared nervous and immediately began asking specific questions about what case they were investigating and why they thought she might be involved. When Agent Walsh explained that they couldn't provide details, but that it involved an infant death from 2009, Lieutenant's demeanor changed dramatically. At first, Lieutenant denied ever being pregnant, insisting that the investigators must have made some kind of mistake. She claimed that she would remember something as significant as a pregnancy and that there was no way she could be connected to any infant death. But when pressed for a DNA sample, she hesitated, asking multiple questions about the testing process and what would happen to her DNA afterward. Agent Walsh, trained in interrogation techniques and behavioral analysis, recognized the signs of deception immediately. Lieutenant's body language, her inconsistent statements, and her obvious anxiety all suggested that she was hiding something significant. But without a confession or direct evidence, they needed that DNA sample to move forward. After nearly 2 hours of conversation, Lieutenant finally agreed to provide a DNA sample, but only after consulting with an attorney. She scheduled an appointment for the following week, giving the investigation team time to prepare for what they increasingly believed would be a positive match. The DNA sample was processed at the Wisconsin State Crime Lab with highest priority. On March 1, 2021, the results came back with scientific certainty. Karen Lieutenant was baby Teresa's biological mother. The DNA markers were an exact match, confirming what the genetic genealogy investigation had predicted. Sheriff Schmidt received the call at 3:47 p.m. on that March afternoon, and he immediately began planning for Lieutenant's arrest. But first, they needed to build a comprehensive case that would stand up in court. They had the DNA evidence, but they needed to understand exactly what had happened on the day baby Teresa died and why Lieutenant had made the decisions she made. The investigation took on new urgency as detectives. began piecing together Lutinen's life in 2009. They discovered that she had been living in Shorewood, a suburb of Milwaukee, with her boyfriend who was baby Teresa's father. She had been working in marketing for a local company and appeared to be living a normal, stable life with no apparent problems or crisis that might explain her actions. What puzzled investigators was the complete absence of any evidence that Lutinen had been pregnant. They interviewed her co-workers from 2009, her neighbors, her friends, and even distant family members. Nobody remembered her being pregnant. Nobody recalled her taking maternity leave or even appearing to gain weight during the relevant time period. The more they investigated, the more remarkable Lutinen's deception became. She had somehow managed to conceal an entire pregnancy from everyone in her life, including the baby's father with whom she was living. The psychological implications of such complete denial and concealment suggested a level of mental distress that investigators had rarely encountered. Detective Mills began researching cases of concealed pregnancy, also known as pregnancy denial, and discovered that the phenomenon was more common than most people realized. Studies suggested that approximately 1 in 400 pregnancies involved some degree of denial, with the most extreme cases involving women who remained unaware of their pregnancy until labor began. But Lutinen's case appeared to involve conscious concealment rather than psychological denial. The evidence suggested that she knew she was pregnant, but had made a deliberate decision to hide the pregnancy from everyone around her. This distinction would prove crucial in understanding her motivations and the circumstances that led to baby Teresa's death. On March 15, 2021, armed with DNA evidence and a growing understanding of the circumstances surrounding the case, investigators approached Lutinen for a formal interview. This time they weren't asking for a DNA sample or elimination from consideration. They were seeking answers about what had happened to her daughter 13 years earlier. The interview took place at the Dodge County Sheriff's Office, with Lutinen accompanied by her attorney, Anik Ahmad. Ahmad had reviewed the DNA evidence and understood that his client was facing serious charges, but he encouraged her to cooperate with the investigation and tell the truth about what had happened. What Lutinen revealed during that interview would shock even veteran investigators who thought they had seen everything. Her story was a heartbreaking tale of fear, shame, and decisions made in moments of panic that would haunt her for the rest of her life. According to Lutinen's statement, she had indeed known she was pregnant, but had been in complete denial about the reality of her situation. She was terrified that her boyfriend would leave her if he knew about the pregnancy, and she convinced herself that she could somehow make the problem disappear without anyone ever knowing. She had managed to conceal her pregnancy through loose clothing, avoiding social situations where her condition might be noticed, and making excuses for changes in her behavior or appearance. The psychological toll of maintaining such an elaborate deception had been enormous, but she felt trapped by her own lies and unable to seek help. On the night of April 28, 2009, Lutinen went into labor alone in her Shorewood home while her boyfriend was working late. She gave birth in the bathtub with no medical assistance and no preparation for what she would do when the baby arrived. According to her statement, baby Teresa was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, a condition known as nuptial cord that occurs in about 25% of all births. In most cases, medical professionals can quickly resolve this issue, but without proper medical care, it can be fatal. Lutinen claimed that she lost consciousness for approximately 15 minutes after the birth, and when she awakened, baby Teresa was not breathing and appeared to be dead. In a state of shock and panic, she wrapped the baby in a towel and placed her in a garbage bag, unable to process what had happened or make rational decisions about what to do next. The drive from Shorewood to Teresa took approximately 45 minutes, during which Lutinen said she drove aimlessly, trying to decide what to do with her daughter's body. She eventually chose the wooded area near Teresa because it seemed peaceful and isolated, a place where the baby could rest without being disturbed. Lutinen's account was consistent with the physical evidence found at the scene and the medical examiner's findings about baby Teresa's cause of death. The Nuchal cord explanation matched the fetal demise determination, and the lack of trauma or other injuries supported her claim that she had not intentionally harmed the baby. But even if Lutinen's version of events was completely accurate, she had still committed a serious crime by concealing the death of a child and failing to report the birth and death to authorities. Under Wisconsin law, anyone who conceals the death of a child can be charged with a felony punishable by up to 18 months in prison and 2 years of extended supervision. On March 18, 2022, exactly 13 years after baby Teresa's funeral, Karin Lutinen was formally charged with concealing the death of a child. The arrest brought closure to one of Wisconsin's most heartbreaking cold cases, but it also raised difficult questions about justice, punishment, and the complex circumstances that can lead ordinary people to make extraordinary bad decisions. The community of Teresa, which had rallied around baby Teresa 13 years earlier, found themselves grappling with mixed emotions about Lutinen's arrest. Many felt relief that the case had finally been solved and that someone was being held accountable for abandoning the baby they had come to love. But others struggled with sympathy for a woman who had clearly been in crisis and may have needed help rather than punishment. Sheriff Schmidt understood the complexity of the community's response, but he remained focused on the fact that justice was finally being served. Baby Teresa deserved to have her story told, her mother identified, and the circumstances of her death properly investigated and adjudicated through the legal system. The arrest of Karin Lutinen marked the end of the investigation phase of the baby Teresa case. But it was only the beginning of a legal process that would force everyone involved to confront difficult questions about responsibility, forgiveness, and the price of secrets that destroy lives and tear apart families. The courtroom in Juneau, Wisconsin was packed to capacity on March 18, 2022, as Karin Lutinen made her initial appearance before Judge Martin de Vries. 13 years of waiting, wondering and grieving had led to this moment, and the weight of that history was palpable in the air as the proceedings began. Lutinen sat quietly beside her attorney, Anik Ahmad, appearing smaller and more fragile than anyone had expected. The woman who had carried such a devastating secret for over a decade looked like she might collapse under the pressure of finally having her truth exposed to the world. Her hands trembled as she listened to the charges being read against her. District Attorney Kurt Klomberg stood to address the court, his voice carrying the weight of 13 years of investigation and community anguish. "Your Honor," he began, "this case represents one of the most heartbreaking situations we've encountered in Dodge County. A baby girl, full-term and healthy, was found abandoned in our community 13 years ago. Today, we finally have answers about what happened to baby Teresa, and we can begin the process of seeking justice for this innocent child." The initial hearing was relatively brief, focusing primarily on setting bail and ensuring that Lutinen understood the charges against her. Judge de Vries set bail at $2,500, a relatively modest amount that reflected the non-violent nature of the crime and Lutinen's lack of any prior criminal history. She posted bail immediately after the hearing, walking out of the courthouse as media crews captured her first public appearance since her arrest. Ahmad spoke briefly to reporters outside the courthouse, carefully choosing his words to protect his client while acknowledging the community's pain. "This case involves the death of a stillborn child, which is always a tragedy for the parents involved," he said. "Further facts about the case will come to light over the course of the legal process. Ms. Lutinen is presumed innocent under the law, and I would ask that the community respect her privacy during this difficult time, but privacy was something that would be difficult to maintain in a case that had captured the attention of people across Wisconsin and beyond. The baby Teresa story had all the elements that fascinated the public: a decades-old mystery, cutting-edge forensic science, and questions about justice and forgiveness that resonated with anyone who had ever made a mistake they wished they could take back. Local media coverage was intense, but generally respectful, focusing on the facts of the case rather than sensationalizing the personal details of Lutinen's life. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel published a comprehensive timeline of the investigation, while television stations across Wisconsin featured interviews with community members who remembered baby Teresa's funeral and the impact her death had on the town of Teresa. The most poignant coverage came from WLUK-TV, which interviewed some of the people who had attended baby Teresa's funeral 13 years earlier. Todd Michael, the funeral director who had donated his services, spoke about the emotional toll of burying a child whose family couldn't be found. "I've been in this business for 30 years, he said, and I've never experienced anything quite like that funeral. The whole community came together to make sure that baby knew she was loved, even if her own family couldn't be there." As the legal process moved forward, more details about Lutinen's life in 2009 began to emerge through court documents and police reports. The picture that developed was of a woman living an apparently normal life who had somehow managed to completely conceal one of the most significant events that can happen to a human. Investigators had interviewed dozens of people who knew Lutinen in 2009, and their accounts painted a consistent picture of someone who had seemed happy and stable. Co-workers at the marketing firm where she worked remembered her as reliable and professional, with no signs of distress or unusual behavior during the time period when she would have been pregnant. Even more remarkably, her boyfriend and the father of baby Teresa had no idea that Lutinen had been pregnant. In his interview with investigators, he described their relationship as strong and loving, with no secrets or problems that might have caused her to hide such a significant development. He expressed shock and disbelief when confronted with the DNA evidence, struggling to understand how the woman he thought he knew could have kept such a massive secret. The psychological implications of Lutinen's behavior fascinated mental health professionals who followed the case. Dr. Margaret Spinelli, a psychiatrist at Columbia University who specializes in pregnancy denial and concealment, explained to reporters that such extreme cases often involve complex psychological factors that can make even the most dramatic physical changes seem invisible to both the woman and those around her. In cases of pregnancy concealment, Dr. Spinelli explained, women often develop elaborate coping mechanisms that allow them to rationalize away the physical and emotional changes they're experiencing. They may attribute weight gain to other factors, explain away missed periods, and even interpret fetal movement as digestive issues. The psychological need to deny the pregnancy can be so strong that it overrides obvious physical evidence. But what made Lutinen's case particularly unusual was the apparent planning and deliberate nature of her concealment. Unlike women who experience true pregnancy denial and remain genuinely unaware of their condition, Lutinen's behavior suggested conscious choices to hide her pregnancy from everyone in her life. The criminal complaint, filed by District Attorney Klomberg, provided the most detailed account of what had happened on the night baby Teresa died. According to Lutinen's statement to investigators, she had been experiencing labor pains throughout the day on April 28, 2009, but had managed to conceal her distress from her boyfriend. That evening, while he was working late, she went into active labor and gave birth alone in the bathtub of their Shorewood home. She told investigators that she had no medical supplies, no preparation for delivery, and no idea what to do when the baby arrived. The birth was complicated by the umbilical cord being wrapped around baby Teresa's neck, a condition that might have been manageable with proper medical care but proved fatal without intervention. Lutinan's account of losing consciousness after the delivery was consistent with the medical reality of unassisted childbirth, which can cause severe blood loss and shock. When she regained consciousness, she found baby Teresa lifeless and was overcome with panic about what to do. Next, the decision to place the baby in a garbage bag and drive to a remote location to abandon the body represented a series of choices that would haunt Lutinan for the rest of her life. In her statement, she described driving aimlessly for over an hour, unable to decide what to do, before finally choosing the wooded area near Teresa because it seemed peaceful and isolated. What struck investigators as particularly tragic was Lutinan's explanation for why she had concealed the pregnancy in the first place. She told them that she had been terrified her boyfriend would leave her if he knew she was pregnant, and that she had convinced herself she could somehow make the problem disappear without anyone ever knowing. This fear-based decision-making had led to a cascade of increasingly desperate choices that ultimately resulted in baby Teresa's death and 13 years of community grief. If Lutinan had sought medical care during her pregnancy or called for help during the delivery, baby Teresa might have survived. If she had contacted authorities after the baby's death, the case would never have become the heartbreaking mystery that haunted Dodge County for over a decade. The father of baby Teresa struggled to process the revelation that he had lost a daughter he never knew existed. In his statement to investigators, he expressed anger, grief, and confusion about Lutinan's choices. He described feeling betrayed by her deception, but also worried about the mental state that had led her to make such devastating decisions. Their relationship had continued for years after baby Teresa's death, with Lutinan carrying the secret of their daughter's existence and death while maintaining the facade of a normal life. The psychological toll of such sustained deception was difficult for anyone to imagine, and it raised questions about Lutinan's mental health both during and after the events of 2009. As the case moved through the legal system, the community of Teresa found themselves grappling with complex emotions about justice and forgiveness. Many residents had attended baby Teresa's funeral and felt a personal connection to the child who had been buried without her family. They wanted accountability for the person responsible for abandoning her, but they also struggled with sympathy for a woman who had clearly been in crisis. Sheriff Schmidt held a community meeting in April 2022 to address residents' questions and concerns about the case. The meeting, held at the Teresa Community Center, drew over 200 people who had been following the investigation for 13 years. Schmidt explained the legal process ahead and acknowledged the complex emotions surrounding Lutinan's arrest. "I understand that this case brings up difficult feelings for many of you," Schmidt told the assembled crowd. "You opened your hearts to baby Teresa when she was found, and you gave her the love and dignity that every child deserves. Now we're learning about the circumstances that led to her death, and that knowledge doesn't take away from the compassion you showed or the significance of what you did for her." The meeting provided an opportunity for community members to process their feelings about the case and ask questions about the legal proceedings ahead. Many expressed relief that the mystery had finally been solved, but others worried about the impact of the media attention on their small town and the families involved. One particularly poignant moment came when an elderly woman stood up to address the sheriff. She had been one of the people who attended baby Teresa's funeral in 2009, bringing flowers and staying for the entire service. "I just want to know," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "whether that baby knew she was loved before she died, whether her mother held her and said goodbye." Sheriff Schmidt's response captured the heartbreak that had defined this case from the beginning. "Ma'am," he said, "I believe that baby Teresa knew love because of what this community did for her. You and everyone else who attended her funeral, who brought flowers, who kept her memory alive for 13 years, you made sure she was loved. That's what matters now. The legal proceedings continued through the spring of 2022, with Luttinen's attorney working to negotiate a plea agreement that would acknowledge her responsibility, while taking into account the unique circumstances of the case. Ahmad argued that his client had been in crisis and needed mental health treatment rather than punishment, while prosecutors maintained that accountability was necessary for the peace of the community and the memory of baby Teresa. The complexity of the case was reflected in the charges themselves. Under Wisconsin law, concealing the death of a child was a felony, but the maximum penalty was only 18 months in prison plus extended supervision. Some community members felt this was insufficient, given the 13 years of anguish baby Teresa's abandonment had caused, while others believed that Luttinen had already suffered enough. Through years of carrying the secret of her daughter's death, District Attorney Klumberg faced the challenging task of seeking justice while acknowledging the tragic circumstances that had led to the crime. He announced plans to pursue legislation that would increase penalties for concealing the death of a child, proposing that it be known as Baby Teresa's Law to honor the memory of the little girl whose case had exposed gaps in Wisconsin's legal framework. As summer approached, the legal and emotional resolution of the Baby Teresa case seemed within reach. But the final chapters of this 13-year saga would prove as complex and heart-wrenching as everything that had come before, forcing everyone involved to confront questions about justice, forgiveness, and the price of secrets that can destroy multiple lives across multiple generations. The plea hearing took place on a humid July morning in 2022, with the same packed courtroom that had witnessed Luttinen's initial appearance 4 months earlier. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. The uncertainty and anger that had characterized the early stages of the legal process had given way to a more somber recognition that everyone involved in this case had been damaged by the events of April 2009. Karin Luttinen stood before Judge Martin de Vries, her voice barely audible as she formally entered her guilty plea to concealing the death of a child. The words seemed to catch in her throat as she acknowledged her responsibility for actions that had haunted an entire community for 13 years. Her attorney, Anik Ahmad, stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder as she struggled to maintain her composure. Judge de Vries carefully reviewed the terms of the plea agreement, ensuring that Luttinen understood the consequences of her decision. The agreement called for a sentence of 3 years probation, including 6 months in the Dodge County Jail, 60 hours of community service, mandatory mental health counseling, and a $5,000 fine. Most importantly, if she successfully completed all terms of her probation, she would avoid the 18-month prison sentence that state law allowed. District Attorney Klumberg addressed the court before sentencing, summarizing the impact that Baby Teresa's case had on the community and the importance of holding Luttinen accountable for her actions. "Your Honor," he said, "this case has affected hundreds of people over the past 13 years. Her community came together to mourn a child they didn't know, to give her dignity in death, and to seek justice for her abandonment. While we understand the difficult circumstances that led to Ms. Luttinen's actions, accountability is necessary for healing and closure." Ahmad responded by presenting a detailed picture of his client's mental state in 2009 and the years of anguish she had endured while carrying the secret of Baby Teresa's death. He described her as a woman who had made terrible decisions in a moment of crisis, but who had lived with guilt and remorse every day since. Ms. Luttinen is not a criminal in the traditional sense, he argued. She is someone who was overwhelmed by circumstances and made choices that she will regret for the rest of her life. The most powerful moment of the hearing came when Judge de Vries offered Luttinen the opportunity to address the court. For several minutes, she stood silently, tears streaming down her face before finally finding the strength to speak. Her words, barely above a whisper, would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. I think about her every day, Luttinen said, her voice breaking with emotion. I think about what she would have looked like, what kind of person she would have become, what her life would have been like if I had made different choices. I can't bring her back and I can't undo what I did, but I want this community to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the pain I caused, for the years of wandering and grief, and for depriving my daughter of the chance to live and be loved. The courtroom was completely silent as Luttinen struggled to continue. I was scared and alone, and I made decisions that I will never be able to forgive myself for. I know that saying I'm sorry isn't enough, but it's all I can offer. I hope that someday, somehow, this community can find peace. And I hope that my daughter knows that I loved her. Even though I failed her so completely, Judge de Vries sentenced Luttinen to the terms outlined in the plea agreement, but his comments from the bench reflected the complexity and tragedy of the case. Ms. Luttinen, he said, your actions 13 years ago set in motion a chain of events that caused immeasurable pain to many people. A community was forced to grieve for a child they didn't know, and families have been torn apart by secrets and lies. While I understand that you were in crisis, your choices had consequences that extended far beyond your own life, the judge continued. However, I also recognize that this case involves circumstances that are difficult for any of us to fully understand. The death of baby Teresa appears to have been a tragedy that was compounded by fear and poor judgment rather than malicious intent. The sentence I'm imposing today reflects both the need for accountability and the recognition that punishment alone cannot heal the wounds this case has. Created September 16, 2022, marked another significant milestone in the baby Teresa case when Luttinen began serving her 6-month jail sentence. The Dodge County Jail, a modest facility in downtown Juneau, became the unlikely setting for the next chapter of a story that had captivated Wisconsin for over a decade. Sheriff Schmidt, who had invested so much of his career in solving the case, reflected on the mixed emotions he felt as Luttinen began her incarceration. There's no satisfaction in putting someone in jail for this kind of case, he admitted to reporters. We wanted answers, we wanted accountability, and we got both. But there's no real winner here. A baby died, a community was traumatized, and families were destroyed. Justice sometimes looks different than what people expect. The 6 months Luttinen spent in jail passed quietly, with little media attention and no incidents. According to jail records, she participated in counseling programs, maintained regular contact with her attorney, and received visits from family members who had learned about baby Teresa's existence only after her arrest. One of the most difficult aspects of Luttinen's incarceration was the continued relationship with baby Teresa's father, who struggled to process his own grief while supporting the woman who had hidden their daughter's existence from him. In interviews with investigators, he described feeling torn between anger at her deception and sympathy for the mental anguish she had endured. Their relationship, which had survived 13 years without him knowing about baby Teresa, faced its greatest test as they both tried to heal from revelations that had shattered everything they thought they knew about their shared past. Counseling sessions, both individual and joint, became a regular part of their lives as they attempted to rebuild trust and understanding. The baby Teresa case had implications that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Law enforcement agencies across Wisconsin and the Midwest took note of the success of genetic genealogy in solving a case that had been cold for over a decade. The collaboration between the Dodge County Sheriff's Office and Ramapo College became a model for other jurisdictions seeking to solve similar cold cases. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, who had led the genetic genealogy investigation, used the baby Teresa case as an example in training sessions for law enforcement agencies interested in adopting similar techniques. This case demonstrates the power of genetic genealogy to provide closure in cases that seemed impossible to solve, she explained to a conference of investigators in Chicago. But it also shows the importance of approaching these investigations with sensitivity and understanding of the human consequences involved. The success of genetic genealogy in the baby Teresa case contributed to a broader revolution in cold case investigations across America. Between 2018 and 2023, genetic genealogy was used to solve hundreds of cases, from decades-old murders to unidentified remains that had puzzled investigators for years. But the baby Teresa case also highlighted some of the ethical challenges associated with genetic genealogy. The investigation had relied on DNA profiles from people who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to public databases, often without fully understanding how that information might be used by law enforcement. This raised questions about privacy, consent, and the appropriate use of genetic information in criminal investigations. Legal scholars and civil liberties advocates began calling for clearer regulations governing the use of genetic genealogy by law enforcement, arguing that the technique's power to solve cases needed to be balanced against individual privacy rights. The baby Teresa case, while successful in bringing closure to a heartbreaking mystery, became part of a larger national conversation about the future of forensic science and criminal investigation. District Attorney Klomberg followed through on his promise to pursue legislation increasing penalties for concealing the death of a child. The proposed Baby Teresa's Law was introduced in the Wisconsin state legislature in early 2023, calling for penalties consistent with those for hiding a corpse and recognizing the severe impact such crimes can have on communities and families. The legislation faced some opposition from advocates who argued that women in crisis needed support and mental health services rather than harsher criminal penalties. But supporters, including many Teresa residents who had been affected by the case, argued that accountability was necessary to prevent similar tragedies and provide proper deterrence. As Lutinen completed her jail sentence and began the probation phase of her punishment, the community of Teresa continued to grapple with the legacy of baby Teresa's case. The annual memorial service at Lowell Cemetery, which had begun as a way to remember an unknown child, took on new meaning as residents processed the revelation of her identity and the circumstances of her death. Todd Michael, the funeral director who had donated his services for baby Teresa's burial, organized a special memorial service in April 2023 to mark the 14th anniversary of her death. This time, however, the service included acknowledgement of her mother's identity and the complex circumstances that had led to the tragedy. "We're not here to judge or condemn," Michael told the assembled crowd. "We're here to remember a little girl who deserved better and to honor the community that came together to give her dignity in death." The story of baby Teresa is complicated and painful, but it's also a story about the power of love and community to transcend even the darkest circumstances. The memorial service drew over 300 people, including some who had never attended before, but had followed the case through media coverage. Among the attendees was Dr. Fitzpatrick from Ramapo College, who had traveled from New Jersey to pay her respects to the child whose case had showcased the potential of genetic genealogy to provide closure and justice. As the service concluded with the placement of flowers on baby Teresa's grave, it was clear that her story had become something larger than the individual tragedy that had begun it. The case had demonstrated the persistence of communities seeking justice, the power of science to solve seemingly impossible mysteries, and the complex nature of human behavior in times of crisis. But perhaps most importantly, baby Teresa's story had shown that even in death, even when abandoned and forgotten, a child could inspire love, community, and a relentless pursuit of truth that would ultimately bring closure to those who had opened their hearts to her memory. The final chapter of the baby Teresa case would be written not in courtrooms or police stations, but in the ongoing efforts of a community to heal, to learn, and to ensure that the lessons of this tragedy would prevent similar heartbreak in the future. March 2024 marked 15 years since baby Teresa was found in those woods near Teresa, Wisconsin, and 2 years since Karen Luttinen's conviction brought closure to one of the state's most haunting cold cases. The anniversary prompted reflection not just in Dodge County, but across the law enforcement community, where the case had become a touchstone for discussions about genetic genealogy, community healing, and the complex nature of justice in cases involving mental health crises. Luttinen had completed her jail sentence and was well into her probation period, participating in ongoing mental health counseling and community service requirements. According to her attorney, Anik Ahmad, she had found work at a non-profit organization focused on mental health advocacy, channeling her experience into helping other women who faced crisis pregnancies or postpartum mental health challenges. Karine has dedicated herself to ensuring that other women don't face the isolation and fear that led to her tragic decisions, Ahmad explained to reporters marking the anniversary. She understands that she can never undo what happened to baby Teresa, but she's committed to preventing similar tragedies through education and support for women in crisis. The work Luttinen had taken on was particularly poignant given the circumstances of her own case. She had become an advocate for comprehensive mental health services for pregnant women, especially those facing unplanned pregnancies or difficult circumstances that might lead them to conceal their condition from family and friends. Dr. Margaret Spinelli, the Columbia University psychiatrist who had followed the case, noted that Luttinen's advocacy work represented a form of restorative justice that went beyond traditional criminal punishment. When someone has caused harm due to mental health crisis, the path to healing often involves using their experience to help others, Dr. Spinelli explained. Ms. Luttinen's work with crisis pregnancy support shows a genuine commitment to ensuring that other women receive the help she needed but didn't seek. The baby Teresa case had indeed sparked significant changes in how Wisconsin approached both cold case investigations and support services for women in crisis. The Dodge County Sheriff's Office had become a leader in genetic genealogy investigations, working with other jurisdictions across the Midwest to solve cases that had been cold for decades. Sheriff Schmidt, who retired in late 2023, reflected on the case that had defined the final years of his career. Baby Teresa taught us that persistence and new technology can solve cases we thought were impossible, he said during his retirement ceremony. But more importantly, she taught us about the power of community and the importance of never giving up on seeking justice for those who can't speak for themselves. Schmidt's successor, Sheriff Jennifer Martinez, had worked on the baby Teresa case as a detective and brought that experience to her new role. Under her leadership, the Sheriff's Office established a cold case unit specifically focused on using genetic genealogy and other advanced techniques to solve historical cases. We learned from baby Teresa that every case matters, no matter how old or how challenging. Martinez explained to the Dodge County Board, "We owe it to victims and their families to use every tool at our disposal to seek answers and accountability." The genetic genealogy revolution that had solved baby Teresa's case continued to transform law enforcement across the country. By 2024, the technique had been used to solve over 1,000 cold cases, from the Golden State Killer in California to Jane and John Doe cases that had puzzled investigators for decades. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick and her team at Ramapo College had expanded their program significantly, training law enforcement agencies across the United States and internationally in genetic genealogy techniques. The baby Teresa case was featured prominently in their training materials as an example of how the technology could provide closure in cases involving unidentified victims. Baby Teresa represents The perfect example of how genetic genealogy can give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Dr. Fitzpatrick told a conference of international investigators in London, her case shows that science and persistence can overcome even the most challenging circumstances to provide answers and justice. The success of genetic genealogy had also prompted important discussions about privacy, ethics, and the appropriate use of genetic information in criminal investigations. The Baby Teresa case, while clearly demonstrating the benefits of the technology, had also raised questions about whether people who voluntarily submitted DNA to genealogy websites had truly consented to its use in criminal investigations. Legal scholars and privacy advocates had called for clearer regulations governing genetic genealogy investigations, arguing that the technique's power needed to be balanced against individual privacy rights. Some states had enacted legislation requiring warrants for genetic genealogy searches, while others had created oversight committees to review such investigations. The debate over genetic genealogy regulation had been particularly intense in Wisconsin, where the success of the Baby Teresa case had led to increased use of the technique by law enforcement agencies. State legislators had worked to craft policies that would preserve the investigative benefits of genetic genealogy while protecting privacy rights and ensuring appropriate oversight. The proposed Baby Teresa's law, which would have increased penalties for concealing the death of a child, had faced more complex political dynamics than District Attorney Klomberg had initially anticipated. While there was broad support for holding people accountable for such crimes, mental health advocates had successfully argued for amendments that would require courts to consider mental health factors in sentencing and provide treatment options as alternatives to incarceration. The final version of the legislation, passed in early 2024, struck a balance between accountability and compassion. It increased maximum penalties for concealing the death of a child, but also mandated mental health evaluations in such cases and required courts to consider treatment and support services as part of sentencing decisions. Baby Teresa's law recognizes that these cases often involve people in crisis who need help as much as they need accountability, explained State Representative Sarah Chen, who had shepherded the legislation through the Assembly. We wanted to honor Baby Teresa's memory by preventing similar tragedies, not just by punishing those responsible for them. The community of Teresa had found its own ways to honor Baby Teresa's memory and process the complex emotions surrounding her case. The annual memorial service at Lowell Cemetery had evolved into a broader community event focused on supporting families in crisis and promoting mental health awareness. The Teresa Community Foundation had established a scholarship fund in Baby Teresa's name, providing financial support for young women pursuing education in social work, mental health counseling, or related fields. The scholarship recipients were required to complete community service projects focused on supporting women and families in crisis. Local churches and community organizations had also collaborated to create a crisis pregnancy support network that provided counseling, medical care, and practical assistance to women facing difficult pregnancies. The program was designed to ensure that no woman in Dodge County would face the isolation and fear that had led to Baby Teresa's death. "We can't bring Baby Teresa back," explained Pastor Michael Hansen of Teresa Lutheran Church, who had helped organize the support network. "But we can make sure that her death leads to life-saving support for other women and children. That's how we can honor her memory and find meaning in this tragedy." The Baby Teresa case had also had profound personal impacts on the individuals most directly involved. Karin Luttinen and Baby Teresa's father had continued their relationship through counseling and mutual commitment to healing, though both acknowledged that they would never fully recover from the revelations about their shared past. In a rare public statement issued through her attorney in 2024, Luttinen reflected on the 5 years since Baby Teresa's identity had been revealed. I will never stop grieving for my daughter and for the choices I made that led to her death, she wrote. But I've learned that the best way to honor her memory is to help ensure that other women don't face the fear and isolation that led to my terrible decisions. Every woman I'm able to help find support and care is a small step toward making baby Teresa's life and death meaningful. The father, who had requested anonymity throughout the legal proceedings, had also become involved in mental health advocacy, particularly focusing on the impact of concealed pregnancies on fathers who learn about children they never knew existed. His experience had highlighted an often overlooked aspect of such cases: the grief and trauma experienced by fathers who discover they have lost children they never had the opportunity to know or love. Detective Mills, now a lieutenant with the Dodge County Sheriff's Office, had become a recognized expert in genetic genealogy investigations and frequently spoke at law enforcement conferences about the baby Teresa case. She emphasized the importance of treating such cases with sensitivity and understanding, recognizing that the families involved were often dealing with complex trauma and grief. Baby Teresa taught me that solving a case is just the beginning, Mills told a conference of cold case investigators in Las Vegas. The real work is helping everyone involved heal from the trauma and find ways to move forward. In cases like this, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about understanding, accountability, and creating meaning from tragedy. The case had also influenced how law enforcement agencies approach investigations involving mental health crises. Training programs now emphasize the importance of understanding psychological factors that might influence suspect behavior, and many departments had developed partnerships with mental health professionals to assist in such cases. As 2024 drew to a close, the baby Teresa case continued to resonate in law enforcement, academic, and community circles. The case had demonstrated the power of persistence, community, and advancing technology to solve seemingly impossible mysteries. But it had also highlighted the complex human factors that can lead ordinary people to make devastating decisions. The story of baby Teresa had become more than just a cold case success story. It had evolved into a narrative about the importance of mental health support, the power of community compassion, and the possibility of finding meaning and healing even in the darkest circumstances. In the end, baby Teresa's legacy was not just about the genetic genealogy breakthrough that identified her mother or the legal accountability that followed. Her legacy was found in the community that came together to love a child they had never known, the families who found healing through tragedy, and the systems that were changed to prevent similar heartbreak in the future. The tiny grave at Lowell Cemetery, marked now with a headstone that bears her name and the dates of her brief life, has become a symbol of hope as much as sorrow. Visitors often leave flowers, toys, and handwritten notes expressing their continued love for a child who, in death, had taught an entire community about the power of persistence, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us all. Baby Teresa's story reminds us that justice comes in many forms, that healing requires both accountability and forgiveness, and that even the briefest lives can have profound and lasting impact on the world around them. In solving her case, investigators didn't just close a file or resolve a mystery. They honored the memory of a child who deserved better and ensured that her death would lead to life-saving changes for others. The woods near Teresa, Wisconsin, are quiet now, marked only by the knowledge of what happened there 15 years ago. But the impact of baby Teresa's story continues to ripple outward, changing lives, solving cases, and reminding us all that every life matters. Every truth deserves to be told, and every community has the power to transform tragedy into hope. September 2024 brought an unexpected development that would further cement baby Teresa's legacy in the annals of forensic science. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick received a call from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit requesting her expertise on a case that bore striking similarities to baby Teresa's story. This time, it wasn't just about solving one cold case, but about using the lessons learned from baby Teresa to develop a completely new protocol for investigating abandoned infant cases across the United States. FBI had identified a pattern of similar cases spanning 3 decades and 12 states, all involving newborns found abandoned in rural areas with no immediate leads to their identities or families. Traditional investigative methods had failed in each case, leaving dozens of baby Teresas buried in unmarked graves or stored in evidence rooms. Their stories untold and their families unknown. Agent Sarah Chen, who led the FBI's new genetic genealogy cold case initiative, explained to a packed conference room at Quantico how the baby Teresa case had revolutionized their approach. Before baby Teresa, we looked at each abandoned infant case as an isolated tragedy, she said. Now we understand that these cases often follow patterns, and more importantly, that genetic genealogy combined with psychological profiling can provide answers that seemed impossible just 5 years ago. The protocol developed from baby Teresa's case, now known as the Teresa method, combined genetic genealogy with enhanced psychological evaluation, community outreach programs, and specialized training for first responders dealing with abandoned infant cases. The method emphasized treating these cases not as criminal investigations first, but as mental health crises that required compassionate intervention alongside law enforcement. Response Fitzpatrick had worked closely with Dr. Margaret Spinelli to develop psychological profiles that could help investigators understand the mindset of mothers who might conceal pregnancies and abandon infants. Their research, published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in late 2024, used the baby Teresa case as a primary example of how fear, shame, and mental health crises could lead to decisions that seemed incomprehensible to outsiders. Karin Luttinen's case taught us that the women involved in these situations are often victims themselves. Dr. Spinelli explained during a webinar for law enforcement agencies. They're not monsters or heartless criminals. They're people in crisis who made devastating decisions while dealing with overwhelming fear, isolation, and often untreated mental health conditions. The impact of this research extended far beyond law enforcement. Medical schools across the country began incorporating lessons from the baby Teresa case into their obstetrics and emergency medicine curricula, teaching future doctors to recognize signs of concealed pregnancy and to approach such cases with sensitivity and understanding rather than judgment. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, who directs the emergency medicine program at the Medical College of Wisconsin, explained how the baby Teresa case had changed medical education. We now train our students to understand that a woman who arrives in our emergency department in labor, claiming she didn't know she was pregnant, might be telling the truth. Pregnancy denial is a real psychological phenomenon, and our response can mean the difference between life and death for both mother and child. The ripple effects of baby Teresa's case reached international borders as well. In November 2024, Dr. Fitzpatrick was invited to address the International Association of Chiefs of Police conference in London, where she presented the baby Teresa case to an audience of investigators from over 40 countries. The presentation sparked immediate interest in developing similar genetic genealogy programs in Europe. Australia and Canada Detective Chief Inspector James Walsh of Scotland Yard approached Dr. Fitzpatrick after her presentation with details about 3 similar cases in the United Kingdom that had remained unsolved for over 20 years. Within 6 months, the collaboration between Ramapo College and British authorities had led to the identification of 2 mothers and the resolution of cases that had haunted communities across England. The success of these international collaborations led to the establishment of the Global Genetic Genealogy Network in early 2025, with baby Teresa's case serving as the founding example of how science, persistence and compassion could provide closure in the most challenging cases. The network now includes laboratories and investigators from 23 countries, all working together to solve cold cases and provide answers to families who had given up hope. Meanwhile, back in Wisconsin, the personal healing journey of baby Teresa's family continued to evolve in ways that surprised everyone involved. Karin Lutinen's work with the Crisis Pregnancy Support Network had grown from a probation requirement into a passionate calling that consumed much of her time and energy. By 2025, Lutinen had personally counseled over 200 women facing crisis pregnancies, helping them navigate the fear and isolation that she understood better than anyone. Her approach was unique in the field because she could speak from personal experience about the devastating consequences of hiding pregnancy and avoiding medical care. Karin has an ability to reach women that traditional counselors sometimes can't, explained Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a psychologist who works with the Crisis Pregnancy Network. When she tells a frightened young woman about what happened to baby Teresa, about the price of secrecy and fear, it carries a weight that textbook examples simply can't match. One of the most powerful examples of Lutinen's impact came in March 2025, when she received a call from a 19-year-old college student who had been hiding her pregnancy for 7 months. The young woman, who requested anonymity, had heard Lutinen speak at a mental health awareness event and recognized her own situation in baby Teresa's story. "I was planning to do exactly what she did," the young woman later told a support group. "I was going to give birth alone and figure out what to do afterward. But hearing about baby Teresa, about how that community grieved for a baby they never knew, it made me realize that my baby deserved better. Karin helped me find the courage to tell my family and get proper medical care. The baby, a healthy girl born in April 2025, was placed with adoptive parents who had been waiting for years to start a family. The birth mother continued her education and maintained a relationship with the adoptive family, creating the kind of positive outcome that Lutinen believed could honor baby Teresa's memory. These success stories had begun to accumulate, creating a powerful narrative of redemption and healing that extended far beyond the original tragedy. The Baby Teresa Foundation, established by the Teresa Community Foundation in 2024, had documented over 50 cases where their intervention had prevented potential tragedies similar to baby Teresa's death. The foundation's work had attracted national attention, leading to partnerships with organizations across the United States focused on preventing infant abandonment and supporting women in crisis. The model developed in Teresa, Wisconsin, was being replicated in communities from California to Maine, each adaptation reflecting local needs while maintaining the core principles of compassion, support and intervention. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, who directed the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Infant Protection Program, credited the Baby Teresa case with transforming how America approached abandoned infant cases. Before baby Teresa, our focus was primarily on law enforcement response and trying to identify the mother for prosecution, she explained. Now we understand that the goal should be prevention, early intervention, and treating these situations as public health crises rather than just criminal matters. The legislative impact of baby Teresa's case had also continued to grow beyond Wisconsin's borders. By early 2025, 12 states had passed versions of Baby Teresa's Law, each adapted to local circumstances, but all incorporating the principle that mental health considerations should be part of sentencing. Decisions in cases involving concealed pregnancy and infant abandonment, the most comprehensive version, was passed in California, where Assemblywoman Maria Santos had been deeply moved by baby Teresa's story. The California legislation not only increased penalties for concealing infant deaths, but also mandated funding for crisis pregnancy support services and required training for emergency responders on pregnancy denial and concealed pregnancy cases, baby. Teresa's story showed us that punishment alone isn't enough. Santos explained during the bill signing ceremony, "We need to create systems that catch women in crisis before they make decisions that destroy multiple lives. This legislation is about preventing the next baby Teresa, not just punishing the mothers who abandon their children." The technological innovations inspired by baby Teresa's case continued to evolve as well. Ramapo College had used insights from the case to develop new algorithms for genetic genealogy searches that could identify potential matches more quickly and accurately. These improvements had reduced the average time for genetic genealogy investigations from several months to just a few weeks in many cases. The efficiency improvements had a cascading effect across the cold case investigation community. By 2025, the techniques pioneered in baby Teresa's case had been used to solve over 1,500 cold cases nationwide, providing closure to thousands of families and bringing justice to victims who had been forgotten for decades. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Mills had become one of the most sought-after speakers at law enforcement conferences, sharing lessons learned from baby Teresa's case with investigators around the world. Her presentations always began with the same image, the tiny white casket at baby Teresa's funeral, surrounded by flowers from people who had never met her. "That image reminds us why we do this work," Mills would tell her audience. "It's not about the technology or the scientific breakthroughs, though those are important. It's about giving dignity to victims, providing answers to families, and ensuring that no one is forgotten, no matter how long it takes to find the truth." The training programs Mills had developed were now being used by law enforcement agencies across the United States and internationally. The curriculum included not just technical training in genetic genealogy techniques, but also modules on psychological assessment, community engagement, and victim advocacy. One of the most innovative aspects of the training was its emphasis on long-term community impact. Investigators were taught to consider not just solving the immediate case, but also how their work could contribute to preventing similar tragedies in the future. The baby Teresa case was used as a prime example of how solving one case could create ripple effects that benefited entire communities and saved lives for years to come. The academic study of baby Teresa's case had also expanded significantly. Universities across the country were now offering courses in forensic genetic genealogy, many of which used baby Teresa's case as a central example. The case had become a standard part of curricula in criminal justice, psychology, social work, and public health programs. Dr. Michael Chen, who directed the forensic science program at Northwestern University, had developed an entire semester-long course around the baby Teresa case and its implications. Students studied not just the technical aspects of genetic genealogy, but also the ethical considerations, the psychological factors involved, and the community response to the case. Baby Teresa's case is perfect for education because it touches on so many different disciplines, Dr. Chen explained. Students learn about DNA analysis, family tree construction, criminal investigation, mental health assessment, community organizing, and restorative justice, all through the lens of this one case. It shows them how complex real-world problems require interdisciplinary solutions. The case had also inspired a new generation of researchers and practitioners. Graduate students across the country were writing dissertations on various aspects of the baby Teresa case, from the technical innovations in genetic genealogy to the community healing process to the development of support services for women in crisis. One particularly notable study, conducted by Dr. Lisa Park at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, had followed the long-term mental health outcomes for community members who had been involved in baby Teresa's case. The research showed that people who had participated in the funeral, the investigation, or the subsequent community healing efforts had experienced positive psychological benefits, including increased sense of community connection and purpose. Participating in Baby Teresa's story gave people a way to transform tragedy into meaning, Dr. Park explained. They couldn't save Baby Teresa, but they could honor her memory and help prevent similar tragedies. That sense of agency and purpose had measurable positive effects on their mental health and life satisfaction. As 2025 progressed, the 16th anniversary of Baby Teresa's death approached with a sense of reflection and accomplishment that would have been impossible to imagine in those dark, early days of the investigation. The annual memorial service had evolved into a week-long conference that brought together law enforcement officials, mental health professionals, community organizers, and families affected by infant abandonment from across the United States. The 2025 Baby Teresa Conference, held at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, featured presentations on the latest advances in genetic genealogy, new approaches to crisis pregnancy support, and updates on legislation and policy changes inspired by Baby Teresa's case. But the heart of the conference remained the same, honoring the memory of a little girl whose brief life had created lasting change. Karen Luttinen was scheduled to deliver the keynote address, her first major public speaking engagement since her arrest 3 years earlier. The announcement had generated significant media attention and some controversy, with critics arguing that she shouldn't be given a platform to speak about a case where she was the perpetrator. But conference organizers, led by Dr. Fitzpatrick and Sheriff Martinez, defended the decision. Karen Luttinen's voice is essential to understanding how we prevent future tragedies, Dr. Fitzpatrick explained to reporters. She can speak to the mindset and circumstances that lead to these devastating decisions in a way that no one else can. If we're serious about prevention, we need to hear from people who have lived through these experiences. The speech, delivered to an audience of over 800 people, would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments in the conference's history. Luttinen spoke for 30 minutes about her experience, her daughter's legacy, and the work she had done to honor Baby Teresa's memory through her advocacy and support for other women in crisis. Baby Teresa lived for just a few hours, Luttinen concluded, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. But her impact will last for generations. Every woman who receives support instead of judgment, every mother who seeks help instead of hiding in fear, every child who lives because someone reached out with compassion instead of condemnation. They are all part of Baby Teresa's legacy. She may not have lived long enough to change the world herself, but she changed all of us who carry her story forward. The standing ovation lasted for over 5 minutes, and there wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. Even some of the critics who had questioned Luttinen's inclusion in the conference later admitted that her perspective had been valuable, and her commitment to preventing similar tragedies seemed genuine. As the conference concluded and participants returned to their communities across the country, Baby Teresa's story continued to inspire new initiatives, new research, and new hope for preventing similar tragedies. The little girl who had been found abandoned in a Wisconsin woods 16 years earlier had become a symbol of the power of persistence, the importance of compassion, and the possibility of creating meaning from even the most heartbreaking circumstances. Her legacy lived on in every cold case, solved using genetic genealogy techniques pioneered in her investigation, every woman who received support during a crisis pregnancy, every community that came together to support families in need, and every investigator who refused to give up on seeking justice for the forgotten and abandoned. Baby Teresa's story reminded everyone who heard it that every life has value, every death deserves dignity, and every community has the power to transform tragedy into hope. In a world often marked by division and despair, her story offered proof that love, persistence, and scientific innovation could overcome even the most daunting challenges and create lasting change that would benefit countless future generations. April 29th, 2026. 17 years to the day after baby Teresa was found in those quiet Wisconsin woods. A small ceremony took place that would mark the final chapter of her extraordinary story. The gathering was intimate, perhaps 50 people standing in a circle around her grave at Lowell Cemetery. But the impact of what they represented stretched across continents and touched millions of lives. Karin Luutinen stood at the head of the grave, her hand resting gently on the headstone that bore her daughter's name. Beside her was baby Teresa's father, their relationship having survived the devastating revelations and grown stronger through shared grief and purpose. Sheriff Martinez was there, along with Detective Lieutenant Mills and Dr. Fitzpatrick, who had flown in from New Jersey for this moment that none of them had anticipated when they first began working together years earlier. The ceremony was simple but profound. Each person present had been directly touched by baby Teresa's story, and each carried forward a piece of her legacy in their daily work. They weren't there to mourn anymore, though grief would always be part of their connection to this place. They were there to celebrate a transformation that had taken a tragedy beyond imagination and turned it into a force for healing that continued to grow every single day. Luutinen spoke first, her voice steady and clear in the morning air. 17 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life in those woods, half a mile from here, she said, looking out at the faces gathered around her. I was broken and terrified, and I abandoned my daughter when she needed me most. But you, all of you, didn't abandon her. You gave her the love I couldn't give, the dignity I failed to provide, and the justice she deserved. She paused, placing a single white rose on the grave. Today, I want to tell you about Sarah Martinez, a 22-year-old woman in California who called our crisis hotline 3 weeks ago. She was 8 months pregnant and hadn't told anyone, not her family, not her boyfriend, not her employer. She was planning to give birth alone, just like I did. But she had heard baby Teresa's story, and something about it gave her courage to reach out for help. The audience listened intently as Luutinen continued. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy last Tuesday, surrounded by medical professionals and family members who rallied to support her once they knew she was in crisis. That baby will grow up knowing he was wanted and loved. And Sarah is getting the mental health support she needs to heal from the trauma that almost led her to make the same choice I made. She looked down at the headstone again. That's baby Teresa's real legacy, not the scientific breakthroughs, not the awards or recognition, not even the laws passed in her name. Her legacy is Sarah's baby taking his first breath in a hospital instead of dying alone in a bathtub. Her legacy is every woman who finds courage to ask for help instead of hiding in fear. Dr. Fitzpatrick stepped forward next, carrying a thick folder filled with photographs and documents. I've brought something to share with you all, she said, opening the folder to reveal hundreds of photographs. These are the faces of people whose cases have been solved, using techniques we developed while investigating baby Teresa's death. Murder victims who had been forgotten for decades, children who died without names, families who thought they would never have answers. She held up one photograph after another, each representing a cold case that had been closed, a family that had found peace, a victim who had finally received justice. Every single one of these cases was solved because we refused to give up on baby Teresa, she explained. The genetic genealogy methods we pioneered, the investigative protocols we developed, the community partnerships we built, all of it grew out of our determination to find answers for a little girl who couldn't speak for herself. Dr. Fitzpatrick placed the photographs gently beside the grave. As of this morning, we've used baby Teresa's methods to solve 2,847 cold cases worldwide. That's 2,147 families who have closure, 2,147 victims who have justice, 2,847 stories that have endings, because baby Teresa's story gave us the tools and determination to find them. Detective Lieutenant Mills spoke about the transformation in law enforcement that baby Teresa's case had sparked. When I first arrived at those woods 17 years ago, genetic genealogy was science fiction, she said. Today, it's standard procedure in police departments around the world. We've trained over 10,000 investigators in techniques that started with baby Teresa's case. And those investigators are solving cases that would have remained cold forever. She gestured toward the woods where baby Teresa had been found. That place used to represent failure, mystery, and heartbreak. Today, it represents hope, innovation, and the power of never giving up. Law enforcement academies from 6 countries now bring their cadets here as part of their training to see where modern cold case investigation was born. Sheriff Martinez shared statistics that would have seemed impossible 17 years earlier. The Baby Teresa Foundation has directly prevented 847 cases of infant abandonment through crisis intervention and support services, she announced. 847 babies are alive today, growing up in loving families, because their mothers received help instead of judgment when they faced crisis pregnancies. She continued with even more remarkable numbers. The Genetic Genealogy Laboratory at Ramapo College, which started with baby Teresa's case, now processes over 500 cases per year. The international network Dr. Fitzpatrick established has member organizations in 34 countries. The crisis pregnancy support model developed here in Teresa has been replicated in 127 communities across North America. Baby Teresa's father, who had remained largely out of the public eye throughout the years, chose this moment to speak publicly for the first time about his daughter and her impact. "I never got to hold my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never got to tell her I loved her, never got to protect her, never got to be her father in any way that mattered. But I've watched what she accomplished in death, and I'm more proud of her than I ever thought possible." He looked directly at Luttinen, his expression filled with love and forgiveness that had taken years to develop. "Karen and I lost our daughter 17 years ago, but we gained something else. We gained purpose, we gained the ability to help other families stay together, and we gained the knowledge that even the worst tragedy can create something beautiful if you're willing to do the work." The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new addition to baby Teresa's gravesite. A small memorial garden where visitors could sit and reflect, surrounded by plaques honoring the victims whose cases had been solved using methods developed during her investigation. At the center of the garden stood a bronze sculpture of a tree, its branches reaching toward the sky, with small plaques hanging from each branch representing the lives that had been saved or justice that had been served because of baby Teresa's legacy. As the crowd began to disperse, many lingered to read the plaques, to place flowers, or simply to spend a few quiet moments in a place that had become a symbol of hope and transformation. The woods where baby Teresa had been found, once a place of darkness and mystery, had become a pilgrimage site for investigators, advocates, and families seeking healing. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in the people who had been most directly affected by baby Teresa's story. Karin Luttinen had become one of the nation's most respected advocates for women in crisis, her work preventing hundreds of tragedies similar to her own. Baby Teresa's father had established a scholarship fund that had sent dozens of young people to study forensic science, social work, and mental health counseling. Detective Lieutenant Mills had been promoted to Chief of Detectives and was regularly consulted by law enforcement agencies around the world on cold case investigations. Dr. Fitzpatrick had received numerous awards for her pioneering work in genetic genealogy, but she always insisted that baby Teresa deserved the credit for inspiring the innovations that had revolutionized forensic science. Sheriff Martinez had been elected to the state legislature, where she continued to advocate for legislation supporting both crime victims and people in mental health crises. The town of Teresa had grown From a small community known mainly for its agricultural heritage to an international center for training in victim advocacy and crisis intervention, the annual Baby Teresa Conference has become one of the largest gatherings of its kind in the world, drawing thousands of participants from dozens of countries. The economic impact alone had transformed the local community, but more importantly, the conference continued to generate new ideas, new partnerships, and new approaches to preventing tragedy and serving justice. As evening fell on that anniversary day, the woods near Teresa were quiet once again, but they carried within them the echoes of all the lives that had been changed, all the cases that had been solved, all the tragedies that had been prevented because a community had refused to let one little girl be forgotten. Baby Teresa never spoke a word, never took a step, never had the chance to make a single decision about her own life. But her story had become one of the most powerful forces for positive change in modern forensic science and victim advocacy. She has shown the world that every life has meaning, that every death deserves dignity, and that even the most heartbreaking circumstances can be transformed into sources of hope and healing. In solving the mystery of baby Teresa's death, investigators had unlocked something far more valuable than answers to a single case. They had discovered new ways to serve justice, new methods for supporting people in crisis, and new possibilities for turning tragedy into triumph. The little girl, who had been found abandoned in a garbage bag, had become a symbol of the best qualities of human nature. Persistence in the face of mystery, compassion in the presence of tragedy, innovation in response to challenge, and love that transcends even death itself. Baby Teresa's story reminds us that we are all connected, that every choice we make ripples outward in ways we may never fully understand, and that even the briefest life can create changes that last for generations. She teaches us that justice is not just about punishment, but about healing, that science is not just about facts, but about hope, that community is not just about geography, but about shared commitment to protecting the vulnerable and seeking truth. Today, when investigators around the world work late into the night trying to solve cold cases, when genetic genealogists trace family trees to identify unknown victims, when crisis counselors answer phone calls from frightened women, when communities come together to support families in crisis, they are all carrying forward the legacy of a little girl who lived for just a few hours, but whose impact will last forever. Baby Teresa never got to change the world during her life. But in death, she changed it completely, proving that love is stronger than loss, that hope is more powerful than despair, and that even the smallest life can cast the longest shadow of positive change across the landscape of human experience. Her grave at Lowell Cemetery bears a simple inscription: Baby Teresa, April 29, 2009. Brief life, eternal impact, but her true monument is not made of stone. It's made of solved cases, saved lives, healed families, and transformed communities that stretch across the globe, all connected by the thread of her story and the determination of people who refused to let her be forgotten. In the end, baby Teresa's story is not really about death at all. It's about life, about the connections that bind us together, about the power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into sources of light and hope. It's about the truth that every life matters, every story deserves to be told, and every ending can become a new beginning if we have the courage to believe in the possibility of redemption and the power of human beings to create positive change in even the most challenging circumstances. Baby Teresa may have lived for only a few hours, but her legacy will live forever, in every case solved, every life saved, and every family healed because people chose to remember her story and carry her love forward into a world that desperately needs both hope and healing. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.